Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 226, Australia's Own Duchess. Acknowledgement to Robert Wainwright's book, The Duchess of Manchester, which was released on the 1st of April this year, and this podcast contains some of the information presented in his book. In 1926, Nell Stead and her sister boarded a ship from Melbourne to Ceylon, today's Sri Lanka. Their father had organised the trip after Nell and Erin had been nursing their ill mother in the final 2 years of her life and felt that they needed a getaway. Their mother had passed away in the May, aged 53. Before her mother's illness, Nell was a regular in society and described as a piquant beauty. She was demure but feisty. She even caught the eye of Keith Murdoch. Nell was born on the 18th of April 1902 at Ashfield in New South Wales. Her birth name was Lillian Nell Stead, and she was born to David Sidney Stead, who was Irish and known as Sydney, and whose family moved to England by the time he was 6, and Jessie Lily Dickinson. On the 11th of June 1896, Sydney Stead Esquire JP was appointed as a member of the licensing court for the district of Narrandera. Jessie was 14 years younger than David and was born in Sydney in 1873 to Samuel Dickinson and Penelope Brooks Johnston. Samuel was born in Surrey, England. Penelope's grandfather was Lieutenant Colonel George Johnston. George Johnston was born on the 19th of March 1764 at Annan, Dumfriesshire, Scotland, and he was the son of Captain George Johnston, an aide-de-camp to Lord Percy, who was later the 2nd Duke of Northumberland. Percy had obtained a commission for the 12-year-old George as a second lieutenant of Marines on the 6th of March 1776. Johnston went to America with his regiment and took part in the American War of Independence, serving in New York and Halifax during 1777 and 1778, after which he was promoted to first lieutenant. During that campaign, his father was killed. The Duke of Northumberland, who held Johnston's father in high regard, became George's guardian. The young officer subsequently acted as a recruiting officer in the UK before serving aboard the HMS Sultan in the East Indies in 1781. However, he suffered a severe wound in action against the French. He returned to garrison duty in Portsmouth and then volunteered to join the New South Wales Marine Corps, which would accompany the First Fleet to New South Wales. He sailed for Australia on board the convict transport ship Lady Penrhyn in 1788. On arrival in New South Wales, Johnston served as an adjutant to Governor Arthur Phillip and was promoted in 1789 to the rank of Captain Lieutenant of Marines. He transferred from the New South Wales Marine Corps to the locally raised New South Wales Corps in 1791 with the rank of Captain. George Johnston received extensive land grants in the areas of modern Petersham, Bankstown and Cabramatta. His other grants included land which is now the suburb of Annandale, named for his property that was in turn named after the place of his birth. In September 1796, Johnston was appointed aide-de-camp to Governor John Hunter and in 1800 received his brevet rank as Major. In the same year, Johnston was put under arrest by Lieutenant Governor William Patterson on charge of paying spirits to a sergeant as part of his pay and disobedience of orders. Johnston objected to trial by court-martial in the colony, and Hunter sent him to England. There, the difficulties of conducting a trial with witnesses in Australia led to proceedings being dropped, and Johnston returned to New South Wales in 1802. In 1803, George took temporary command of the New South Wales Corps during the illness of Patterson and became involved in the conflict between King and the military. In March 1804, he acted with decision when in command of the military sent against some convicts who had rebelled at Castle Hill. When Patterson was sent to Port Dalrymple, Johnston became commander of the New South Wales Corps. On the 26th of January 1808, Johnston played a key role in the only successful armed takeover of a government in Australia's recorded history, the Rum Rebellion, working closely with John MacArthur. Johnston led the troops that deposed Governor William Bligh and assumed the title of Lieutenant Governor, illegally suspending the Judge Advocate and other officials.
The administration of justice became farcical and there were signs of strong discontent amongst the settlers. He was promoted to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel on the 25th of April 1808 and was superseded by his senior officer, Joseph Fourveau, who was Lieutenant Governor of Norfolk Island, on the 28th of July 1808. Johnston sailed for England with John Macarthur in March 1809 and with Henry Fulton as a witness, and was tried by court-martial in May 1811. He was found guilty of mutiny and sentenced to be cashiered. This lenience of the sentence imposed in the circumstances presumably indicates that the court was convinced that he had been the tool of other people. George Johnston returned to New South Wales in May 1813 as a private individual, and in November of the following year, at St John's Church in Parramatta, he married Esther Abrahams, a Jewish convict whom he'd met on the Lady Penrhyn in 1787. So Nell is in fact a descendant of a convict who became a Duchess. George and Esther had already had 7 children together by the time they married, and they lived on his land at Annandale Farm. He died much respected on the 5th of January 1823. He was at first interred in a private mausoleum on his Annandale property until its subdivision to become an inner-city suburb. His remains were moved to a new mausoleum at Waverley Cemetery in 1904. The suburb of George's Hall is named after the farmhouse of the same name on land grants that Johnston received near the junction of Georges River and Prospect Creek. This building still exists and is now one of Australia's oldest houses. George and Esther and their children farmed and lived on Annandale until the 1870s, when the property was sold and subdivided for residential development. The main street of Annandale is named after Johnston, and the gates of their property now stands in the grounds of the Annandale Public School. Their son and Penelope's father, Robert, was born on the 9th of March 1792 at the Sydney Military Barracks. He was one of the first white European Australians to be born in the fledgling colony. He inherited from his father the same spirit which distinguished that officer during his official career in the colony. Robert married Frances Weller on the 13th of July 1831 at St James's Church in Sydney when she was 19 and Robert 39. They ended up having 9 children, Penelope being the 5th. On the 16th of September 1882 in the Sydney Mail and New South Wales Advertiser, it outlines his death. Captain Robert Johnston, R.N. Captain Johnston, R.N. was one of those men, so few in number now and so rapidly disappearing, whose lives are linked between the old world and the new. Being born in Sydney in 1790, Captain Johnston's infant days were passed in New South Wales during one of the most interesting periods of its history, and entering at an early age in the British Navy, to which he remained attached until the opportunities for active service had passed away. He was a participator in some of the most conspicuous events that followed the close of the 18th century. He was the second son of Lieutenant Colonel Robert Johnston of the New South Wales Corps, or 102nd Regiment, and he inherited from his father the resolute spirit which distinguished that officer during his official career in the colony. At 7 years of age, Johnston accompanied his father to England and was placed at school at Newington Butts, Surrey, where he remained until he was 13 years old, and then he entered the Navy as a volunteer of the first class, the first native of New South Wales who joined the service, on board the Malabar, a 50-gun ship. In this vessel he shared the proceedings of the British North Sea Fleet in their blockade of the Dutch and French fleets in the Texel, but without remaining any length of time in that employment, the Malabar was recalled home for the purpose of conveying troops from England to Montevideo. Returning to England after having performed this duty, the Malabar was paid off and young Johnston joined the Namur receiving ship as midshipman, and shortly afterwards was appointed to the Semiramis, a 36-gun frigate commissioned for active service off the coasts of Spain and Portugal. In this position he remained from October 1808 to January 1810, and during that period he was present at the memorable Battle of Corunna. Leaving the Semiramis, he went on board the Norge 74 as master's mate, and being again stationed off the coast of Portugal, he was present at the storming of Cadiz by the French under Marshal Soult, and took part in the attack on St Mary's, where he was in command of a rocket boat, and narrowly escaped death through the boat being sunk by a round shot, and those who were not killed left struggling in the water until a rescue could be effected. Mr Johnston and another officer were subsequently placed with a crew of 150 men on board a captured French 80-gun ship, the Neptune, one of the vessels that escaped from Nelson's fleet after the Battle of Trafalgar, and ordered to proceed with her to Majorca, where she was to be laid up. And this service having been accomplished, he returned to the Norge, which shortly afterwards sailed to England for the purpose of joining the Scheldt fleet under the command of Admiral Sir William Young. Later on, Mr Johnston joined the ACIS, carrying the flag of Vice Admiral Sir Alexander Cochrane, Commander-in-Chief, on the American station. At this period, Great Britain was at war with the US, and the Asia sailed for Bermuda, where Mr Johnston received his commission as lieutenant and was appointed to the command of an advice vessel, or what at the present day would be called a dispatch boat. In this little vessel he saw some fighting and was present when a British fleet ascended Chesapeake Bay and captured the city of Washington. Rejoining Sir Alexander Cochrane on board the Asia at Port Royal, Jamaica, Lieutenant Johnston was directed to place himself under the orders of Sir Peter Parke, commanding the frigate Menaloo, then engaged in blockading the approaches to the city of Baltimore. This he did, and he was present with Sir Peter Parker in the night attack on the Moorfields, where Sir Peter Parker was killed. The death of his commander caused Lieutenant Johnston to be sent with despatches announcing the sad event to Admiral Cochrane, and then returning to the Menaloo, he remained on board that vessel until after the unsuccessful attack by the British forces on Baltimore, when he was directed to proceed to Jamaica and again place himself under the orders of the Commander-in-Chief. This led to him being engaged in the service of landing troops for an attack on New Orleans. Peace was shortly afterwards proclaimed, and Lieutenant Johnston, receiving promotion, was appointed to second lieutenant of his old ship, the Asia, which was then under the command of Captain Alexander Skene, and was employed cruising off the coast of West Florida. On returning home, the ship was paid off, and Lieutenant Johnston found himself ashore with no immediate prospect of further active employment. The idea then occurred to him that the opportunity was a good one for paying a visit to his family in Sydney, and obtained leave of absence, and he sailed for New South Wales and arrived in Sydney in October 1816. Here he received a cordial welcome and had not been in Sydney long before his services were secured by Governor Macquarie for a voyage of discovery in the government cutter Schnapper. While engaged in this duty, he discovered and named the River Clyde, and on returning to Sydney, accompanied the Governor on a visit of inspection to Newcastle and Port Macquarie. During the time they were at the latter place, Lieutenant Johnston was instrumental in saving a vessel called the Lady Nelson from being a total wreck. Subsequently, he formed one of an exploring party under Sir John Jameson, whose object it was to ascertain the source of the Warragamba River, and when his companions decided to return in consequence of the difficulty travelling over the broken country of the mountains, Lieutenant Johnston pressed on, himself accomplished at the object of the expedition. Just at this time, and when he contemplated returning to England, the death of his eldest brother, Mr. George Johnston, occurred through a fall from a horse, and this being followed not long afterwards by the death of his father, Lieutenant Johnston, was induced to abandon his intention of returning to England to resume his duties as an officer in the Navy, a decision he arrived at with the greatest reluctance. The affairs of his family, however, required attention, and remaining in Sydney, he entered into pastoral and agricultural pursuits in conjunction with his brother, David Johnston. In this occupation he became very successful, for his active and vigorous nature was as such to make a success a certainty in almost anything he took in hand, and he has left behind him a large and valuable station and other properties. In the year 1831, he married the eldest daughter of the late Mr. Joseph Weller of Hamershaw County, Bucks, England, and had a family of 7 sons and 2 daughters. In 1865, Lieutenant Johnston was promoted to the rank of Commander in the Royal Navy. So full of health and vigour was he in his later years that about 4 years ago he took a trip to New Zealand and a rough yachting cruise along some part of the coast of New South Wales. He was in good health until last Thursday week, though 92 years of age, was making arrangements to pay a visit to England next March. The funeral took place at Annandale, the body being placed in the family vault. The friends and family assembled to a number of about 150, and besides these, there were present to accord the honours due to a deceased officer of the Royal Navy, a party of blue jackets under the command of a lieutenant from HMS Nelson, a portion of the men being told off to carry the coffin to the grave, and the remainder forming a firing party to pay the last tribute of respect accorded at naval and military funerals. Around the vault was assembled a large gathering of people from the surrounding neighbourhood who watched the proceedings with respectful interest. And Nell's grandmother, Penelope Brooks Dickinson, died in 1933 in Melbourne at the age of 91 years. Her obituary reads that she was the widow of the late Mr. Samuel Dickinson and the only surviving member of the family of the late Commander Robert Johnston, who was born in 1792 and was the first resident of New South Wales to join the British Navy. She was the granddaughter of the late Colonel George Johnston, who came to Australia with the First Fleet in 1788. He was granted 500 acres of what are now known as Annandale and Petersham, and the late Mr Dickinson lived for many years at the Hall, an estate of 50 acres near Croydon Station, which was subsequently subdivided and sold. Mr Dickinson died in 1904, and a few years later his widow moved to Melbourne, where she made her home until her death. She is survived by 2 sons and a daughter, Mr W. R. Dickinson of Melbourne and A. E. Dickinson, and Mrs. I. M. Shields of London, with 19 grandchildren, including the Viscountess Mandeville, who's at present visiting Sydney, and 20 great-grandchildren. Nell's parents, David and Jessie, were married on the 29th of January 1901 in Hong Kong. David was 39 and Jessie 28. Nell was their firstborn, and they lived in Sydney until 1905, when they moved to Melbourne. They lived at Elgin in Armidale, Victoria. Her father died in September 1929 in South Yarra, and the Melbourne Argus has his obituary. Regret will be felt in pastoral circles for the sudden death of Sidney V. Stead, which occurred on Wednesday night at his home. Mr Stead was Inspector of Pastoral Properties for the Australian Mercantile Land and Finance Company Limited. He was well known in all grazing and pastoral areas of the eastern states. Before his association with the company, Mr Stead had a wide pastoral experience. For many years he was a manager of Widgewa Station for the late Mr James Cochrane, and was later manager of Yarrabee Station. He was born in the north of Ireland. His father migrated to Tasmania, but later came to the mainland, where he was one of the earliest settlers. He took up property near Geelong, which subsequently became known as Bellpost Hill. The name had its origin in the fact that a sheep bell was erected on a post and rung in the event of a threatening approach of the Aborigines. The property until recently was owned by Senator Guthrie and is now being used as a Presbyterian girls' school. The old bell is still used by the school authorities. Mr Stead's father went back to Great Britain after he resided for some years at Bellpost Hill. Mr Stead returned to Australia, however, and has been connected with the pastoral industry ever since. He was so closely attached to his work, his friends say, that he never took a holiday. He wrote articles from time to time for the Pastoral Review. Apart from his work, Mr Stead's chief recreation was to attend an occasional race meeting. He was a member of the Victoria Racing Club, the Victoria Amateur Turf Club and the Moonee Valley Racing Club. He was also a member of the Australian Club. Mr Stead leaves a son, Mr David Stead, who is overseer of Meawera Station near Nyngan, New South Wales, and 3 daughters, 2 of whom, Viscountess Mandeville and Miss Erin Stead, are now in England. Miss Penelope Stead lives in South Yarra. Mr Stead's wife died 3 years ago. The marriage of his daughter, Miss Nell Stead, to Viscount Mandeville, eldest son of the Duke of Manchester, took place in May 1927. The burial will take place at Brighton Cemetery. So on Nell's trip that her father allowed her and his sister to undertake, she had a chance encounter with a handsome young naval officer by the hotel swimming pool in Colombo, and this changed everything. They had to part company a few days later when he returned to his ship. This mystery man, though, was more than a naval officer. He was Alexander George Francis Drogo Montagu, known as Mandy, who was the eldest son of the 9th Duke of Manchester, and heir to a nearly 500-year-old dynasty. His ancestor, Sir Edward Montagu, was Chief Justice of the King's Bench and an executor of King Henry VII. Another ancestor, Edward, the Earl of Manchester, had a role in the restoration of the crown of Charles II in 1660. The Montagu home, Kimbolton Castle in Cambridgeshire, was the home of Catherine of Aragon in the years after her divorce from King Henry VIII. Catherine of Aragon died there, and her ghost is said to walk the halls. Queen Alexandra stood sponsor at Mandy's christening in the Chapel Royal at St James's Palace on the 17th of December 1902. He was educated at the Royal Naval College in Osborne and the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth, and from Dartmouth he was commissioned into the Royal Navy in 1919. He held the rank of commander when he retired from the service in 1930. In May 1927, Nell sailed to Europe and Mandy was on shore leave, and he waited on the docks of Marseille to escort her to London to marry her. The wedding nearly didn't happen when Mandy, who had a penchant for fast cars, crashed as he left London. They married at Kimbolton Castle, with Nell limping down the aisle, her legs bandaged. At the time of their marriage, the Montagu family finances were in disarray. The castle was shuttered and rarely used. Most of these financial problems were caused by Mandy's grandfather, George, and his father, William. They both married American heiresses in a plan to bolster the family finances. In 1876, Mandy's grandfather married Consuelo Yznaga, the daughter of a wealthy American Cuban plantation owner who came with a $6 million dowry. By 1890, the money was almost gone. He spent it on gambling and mistresses, and he was declared bankrupt. He died 2 years later of cirrhosis of the liver, leaving the estate to his 15-year-old son. William, Mandy's father, married Helena Zimmerman, daughter of the American industrialist Eugene Zimmerman. They separated, and William pursued West End theatre actresses and spent his life fighting off bankruptcy. William was said to say, "I own 3 castles and I can't afford to live in any of them." The Montagus also owned Tandragee Castle in County Armagh in Ireland and Islemore Abbey in County Galway. When Mandy married Nell, his title was the Duke of Mandeville, and it was left to them to restore the family's fortune and reputation. In 1929, Nell gave birth to Sydney, named after her father. Their friends included the Duke of Kent, Prince George, American actress Tallulah Bankhead, and racing car driver Wolf Babe Bonato, who owned the Bentley Car Company. Nell was caught with a dozen others in a gambling den in Piccadilly. She was the only one who revealed her identity in the magistrate's court when she was charged with gambling. The response from the London papers was based more on admiration than scandal. In 1935, Mandy's father and Mandy's younger brother faced court for separate financial crimes. His father, the Duke, allegedly tried to hock the family jewels that were kept locked away in the family trust, and his younger brother Edward, who mainly lived in America, was accused of stealing while working as a secretary for a wealthy widow. Both were convicted, but the Duke was released on appeal. In 1936, after 2 years and tens of thousands of pounds, they restored a section of Kimbolton Castle, including installing electricity. The restoration was done in time for the birth of their second child, Angus. Mandy was now recalled to Ceylon for World War II. Nell took Sydney to America to boarding school initially, and then Nell joined Mandy with 1-year-old Angus. Mandy was a lieutenant colonel on the aircraft carrier Eagle for almost 3 years, where he was awarded an OBE for his bravery when under attack. Mandy was injured in the explosion and helped another sailor search for survivors and bring out those that were injured. In 1942, Mandy was assigned to the naval headquarters at Colombo, and Nell volunteered for the American Red Cross. Kimbolton Castle was trashed by the Royal Army Medical Corps, who used it as a base in the war. Clothing and furniture were trashed or stolen. As a result, Mandy and Nell abandoned the castle and moved to Kenya, where life was cheap and farming promising. They bought and established a cattle property, Kapsiroa, north of Nairobi, where they planned to share 6 months a year between both homes. They also travelled to America regularly in this time. In 1947, Mandy's father died and Mandy became the 10th Duke of Manchester, and Nell became Australia's first and only Duchess. Due to its decay, Kimbolton was compulsorily acquired to be a local grammar school. In the summer of 1949, they hosted one of the largest home and estate sales in British history, mainly of paintings of family members and kings and queens of England. Shockingly, most of them were sold off for only $100 each. During the 1950s, the Duke also sold Tandragee Castle in Northern Ireland. By the 1960s, he also sold most of the other landed estates in the British Isles, which had been bestowed to him. Nell died on the 2nd of September 1966 at Hillsborough, San Mateo, California, America. On the 7th of February 1969, Mandy married for the second time Coleman Croker, née Fullerton, the daughter of Samuel Clyde Fullerton of Miami, Oklahoma, United States. She'd been formerly married to oil magnate George L. Coleman, then to William Willard Crocker, a son of William Henry Crocker and grandson of Charles Crocker. They didn't have any children. At the time of his death in 1977, he was listed as living at Kapsiroa at Kenya, but he died in London after running through most of his inherited wealth. By the time he died, his English estate was valued at only £70,000. Mandy and Nell's children. Sydney Arthur Robin George Drogo Montagu was born on the 5th of February 1929 at Kimbolton Castle at Huntingdonshire, England. He married Adrienne Valerie Christie on the 5th of February 1955 at the All Saints Cathedral at Nairobi in Kenya. Adrienne had been born in South Africa. Adrienne was the daughter of Commander John Kenneth Christie, Ambassador of South Africa in Kenya. Sydney farmed at Carrawater near Cape Town, South Africa, and they divorced in 1978. He married for the second time on the 25th of August 1978 to Andrea Joss, daughter of Cecil Alexander Joss of Johannesburg, South Africa, who'd previously been married twice to Major Whitehead and GJW Kent. He had no children from either marriage. In 1983, the Duke sued his stepmother Elizabeth, who he believed had possession of several family heirlooms that he felt were rightfully his. He died suddenly at Robin Hood Ranch, Tennessee, in the US on the 3rd of June 1985, aged just 56. In later life, Sydney, as the 11th Duke, had a fraught relationship with his younger brother Angus. Upon the death of Andrea, Sydney's second wife, in 1996, Angus discovered that she changed the will so the entire estate would go to her eldest child, which was the 11th Duke's stepson, and the 12th Duke would receive nothing. So that leads us to Angus. Angus Charles Drogo Montagu was born on the 9th of October 1938 at Kimbolton Castle, Huntingdon, England. He moved frequently during childhood, including spending time in Singapore and Ceylon, including a period in a convent at Ceylon. He did not enjoy his time here, later saying that the nuns weren't very pleasant people. In 1950, he joined his father in Kenya for a short time after Kimbolton was sold. He had a good relationship with his mother and he was spoilt as a result. He tried the local school in Kenya but was bullied and stopped going, and consequently had no regular formal education until he was 11. He was subsequently educated at Tredur House in Tredur Bay, Anglesey, a Welsh prep school, and Gordonston School at Moray, Scotland, returning each summer to Kenya to spend time with his family. He left school in 1956 without any qualifications and began service in the Royal Marines, boarding HMS Lochfine in January 1957. He was the only public school-educated man on the ship and did not get on well with his fellow recruits. Upon discharge, he had jobs in the oil industry and in tourist-related activities across the US. He moved to Australia in 1959 and was variously employed as a clothes salesman, a barman and a crocodile wrestler. He married Mary Evelyn McClure on the 22nd of November 1961 in Geelong when he was 23 and Mary 21. Mary was the daughter of Walter Gillespie McClure, who was the director of General Motors Holden, that was based in Geelong. They separated in 1965 and divorced in 1970. There were 3 children of the marriage. The first was Alexander Charles David Drogo Montagu, who's the 13th Duke of Manchester. He was born in Sydney on the 11th of December 1962. He married in March 1984 in Australia to Marion Johanna Storer. Marion was an Australian model and was 11 years older than Alexander. The relationship lasted 2 months. She left after accusing Montagu of firing a spear gun at her. In 1985, Montagu was sentenced to 3 years in prison after being convicted of 22 charges of fraud. He emigrated to the US in 1986. In 1991, he was arrested again in Brisbane after he sold a car that he'd rented. He married for the second time in California in May 1993 to Wendy Dawn Buford, with whom he had a son, Alexander Michael Charles David Francis George Edward William Kimball Drogo Montagu, who's Viscount Mandeville, on the 13th of May 1993 in Orange County, California, and a daughter, Lady Ashley Faith Maxine Nell Beatrix Montagu, who was born on the 6th of June 1999 at Alice Ovajo, Orange, California. He did not divorce Marion until October 1996 in Victoria. Wendy and Alexander separated after 15 years and were divorced on the 28th of August 2007. He married for the third time to Laura Ann Smith, an American real estate agent, on the 21st of September 2007 in California, and they divorced in October 2011. In 2009, the Duke reportedly then revealed that his marriage to Buford in 1993 had been invalid, as he'd still been married to his first wife in Australia. On these grounds, he stopped making child support payments and the family trust cut off funds to his children. Buford successfully sued on behalf of their 2 children. In 2011, High Court Justice Christopher Floyd ruled that the 2 children, even though they were born when their parents were not lawfully married, were entitled to the trust funds, as Buford reasonably believed that the marriage was valid. In 2013, the Duke was charged again with fraud in Las Vegas for reportedly knowing passing a $3,575 cheque in 2011 without funds, property or credit to back up the cheque. He pleaded no contest to the charge and received a 90-day suspended sentence and 6 months to repay the debt. He failed to repay the debt and failed to appear in court. A bench warrant was issued for his arrest in June 2014. In 2016, he was accused of burglary and making a false police report. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison in 2017, which he served in the High Desert State Prison. There's a book that features Angus and his children in more detail, and it's titled Splendour and Squalor, The Disgrace and Disintegration of Three Aristocratic Dynasties by Marcus Scriven. The second child of Angus was Lord Kimball William Drogo Montagu, who was born in October 1964. He married Sally Elizabeth Nurse in 1997, and they had 2 children, Emily Elizabeth Beatrix Montagu, born in 1999, and William Anthony Drogo Montagu, born in 2000. The third child was Lady Emma Louise Eveline Montagu, who was born in July 1965. She married Lance Vincent Hodgkinson in 2001, and they had a son, Nicholas James Hodgkinson, on the 5th of November 2002. Emma died on the 29th of April 2014 at age only 48 in Sydney. Angus walked out on Mary days after Emma's birth, so Emma and Angus did not have a proper relationship until 20 years later when he regained contact with her and her brother Kimball. Angus remained distant from Alexander and attempted to bar him from inheriting the title of the Duke of Manchester. Emma briefly lived with Angus in his Bedford flat in the early 1990s. Angus later spent time in Canada, and by 1968 he'd moved into a bedsit in Bedford, England, near Kimbolton. He then married Diane Pauline Plimsoll in January 1971 in Westminster, London. They divorced in 1985 after Montagu had inherited the dukedom. He then married Anne Louise Bird Taylor on the 27th of January 1989 at Bedford. They were divorced in 1998 following his incarceration. She is now Anne Louise, Duchess of Manchester. At the time of the Duke's death, he was attempting to reconcile with Louise. He married for the 4th time to former fashion model Bernadette Hillier, née Jennings, known as Bieber, on the 22nd of April 2000 in Mayfair, Middlesex, England, and they divorced in 2001. The Duke died of a heart attack on the 25th of July 2002 at the age of 63. At the time of his death, his estate had a net deficiency. His funeral had his children, Kimball and Emma, and ex-wives, Diane and Louise, in attendance. His obituary reads, "The life and times of Angus Charles Drogo Montagu, 12th Duke of Manchester, provides the most senior evidence of the risk of recruiting part of the ruling class from the beds of the hereditary aristocracy. In his 1985 fraud trial, he was described as absurdly stupid and negligent by an Old Bailey judge, who added that having his name on the board of any company should send shivers down the spine of any investor. In another fraud trial in Tampa, Florida in 1996, his own counsel said the Duke was the hapless victim of clever conmen. He was used because he's gullible, he's vain and he's foolish." The judge's view in the 1985 case was that on a business scale of 1 to 10, the Duke is 1 or less, and even that flatters him. Angus inherited the title when his older brother, the 11th Duke, died in 1985. It was a great embarrassment to all that this transfer occurred just before the new Duke stood trial at the Old Bailey for conspiracy to defraud the National Westminster Bank of £38,000. The plot, for which 3 other men were convicted, involved providing a bank manager with a stripper for the weekend, then obtaining loans from him using forged US bonds as collateral. Angus was acquitted because the judge's conclusions about his stupidity made it clear he was a dupe. He could claim, though, that he came from a broken home. He was separated from his parents at the age of 2 when he was sent to live with family friends in Ceylon. He rejoined his remote and chilly father in Kenya after the war, then briefly attended Gordonston and served for 3 years in the Royal Marines. After this, he worked on a Texas oil field and a water skiing instructor in Florida before trying his luck in Australia. Here he failed as a trouser salesman in Sydney, but survived wrestling with crocodiles. He also married in 1965 to Geelong secretary May McClure, with whom he had 2 sons and a daughter, though he deserted them in the mid-60s as he fled a bankruptcy petition. They divorced in 1970, one of the grounds being the Duke's adultery. After that, Angus attempted various business ventures in Canada, returning to Britain in 1971 to marry Diane Plimsoll at Dorset, and they divorced in 1985. He made a brief maiden speech in the Lords in 1991, the first Duke of Manchester to speak there for 88 years. But with a top title, fancy tastes and a limited income, Angus was vulnerable to clever fraudsters in need of a titled frontman. In Birmingham in 1987, he tried setting up a Duke's Trust with the Dukes of Norfolk and Wellington as patrons, nominally to help sick children, but the memories of the Old Bailey case were still too fresh. He seemed doomed to play the same role 4 years later in fronting a fraudulent attempt to make a killing out of a franchise in America's National Hockey League. As chairman of Link International, he was paid £30,000 and promised a further $1.7 million if the deal came off. The Duke pretended to be a castle-owning former schoolmate of Prince Charles who wanted to buy into the Tampa Bay Lightning Club. But when the company failed to produce the promised money, the deal went sour and the FBI and Scotland Yard were called in. 4 years later, the Duke was jailed for 33 months, of which he served 28 months before being deported to Britain, where he was divorced by his third wife, the former Anne Louise Bird. His last venture was a luxury coach company called Unique Tours. He is succeeded by his son Alexander and also survived by his two other children. And in November 1997, in the Canberra Times, it says, "Boy third in line for title." In Melbourne, a Victorian schoolboy has become third in line to the title and estates of the Duke of Manchester. Alexander Charles David Drogo Montagu, 14, whose grandfather, the Duke, died in London on Thursday, is the eldest son of Lord Angus Montagu, 40, and Lady Montagu, who were married in 1961 and divorced in 1970. She won the divorce in an uncontested action. The first in line to the title is the elder of the late Duke's two sons, Viscount Mandeville, 48, who farms at Subukia, Kenya. He has no children. The second in line is Alexander's father. And a little on Nell Stead's siblings. Her sister Marie Vere Stead, known as Erin, was born in 1904 in Burwood, New South Wales. She married John Frederick Thornton Grimwade, a clerk in Victoria, in 1930. They had two sons and a daughter, Amanda, who married Tony Keane in 1955. And the marriage of Amanda was in the papers. Highlight of yesterday's round was the quietly celebrated marriage of Amanda Grimwade and Tony Keep at Toorak St John's, with the bride one of the calmest seen in years. It was a family-only attended ceremony, with the young couple's friends meeting at the home of the bride's parents at St George's Road, Toorak, and their honeymoon was to be spent travelling abroad. On the 18th of October 1946 in the Melbourne Herald, Mr. and Mrs. John Grimwade are entertaining a number of their friends at a cocktail party at their home at St George's Road, Toorak, this evening. Interstate friends who've accepted invitations are Mr. and Mrs. Sam Horden, Mr. and Mrs. Frank Packer, and the Tom Porters, who recently returned from India and England. They also had a property in Frankston that they called Marathon. On the 4th of February 1949, in the Melbourne Sun News Pictorial, Mr. John Grimwade has been appointed a director of the Australian Consolidated Industries Limited, filling the vacancy caused by the death of his father, Major General H.W. Grimwade. And on the 24th of November 1956 in the Melbourne Argus, grand set-up. A perfect setting was arranged by Mr. and Mrs. John Grimwade for the delightful dance they gave in Toorak last night. It was a dance that was originally planned as a welcome for Mrs. Grimwade's brother-in-law and sister, the Duke and Duchess of Manchester, who were going to the games as visitors, but at the last moment unfortunately were unable to come. And Erin died in 1976 in Mornington, aged 72. David Vere Stead was born on the 21st of May 1906 in South Yarra, Victoria. David was a clerk in 1931 in South Yarra, and in May 1933 he left Australia. In 1933 he became engaged to Lady Louise Montagu, Mandy's sister. And in 1939 he was a manager of a production department in London. He died on the 4th of May 1959 at Westminster, London, aged only 52. He did not marry. Another sister, Penelope Brooke Vere Stead, was born in 1912 in Victoria, and in 1933 there was an announcement in the paper that she was about to go abroad. Miss Penelope Stead, a daughter of Mr. S.V. Stead of South Yarra, will leave for England next week. On the 14th of December 1933 in the Sydney Sun, from Melbourne, Miss Penelope Stead, the 21-year-old sister of Viscountess Mandeville of England, and of Mrs. John Grimwade of South Yarra, has taken a job selling handkerchiefs in a city store. She's one of the leading members of the Melbourne's younger set. She went over to England again in 1936 and stayed with Nell in England for 8 months. On the 30th of July 1938, they announced in the paper that Penelope and her friend Beryl Cowper, had just returned from a 6-month holiday in America, and they stayed with friends in Boston, and they sailed into Sydney on the Niagara and left for Melbourne. On the 15th of June 1940, it announced that Miss Penelope Brooke V. Stead, youngest daughter of the late Mr. and Mrs. Sidney V. Stead, formerly of Melbourne, whose engagement to Captain John Bowie Somerset, 2nd AIF, abroad, youngest son of Mr. and Mrs. H. St. J. Somerset of St. George's, Toorak, is announced today. She married John Bowie Somerset in Toorak on the 18th of December 1941. John was a surgeon. They had a son, Nigel Brooke Vere Somerset, on the 8th of July 1946 in Toorak, and also had another son. And Penelope died on the 4th of May 1970 in Victoria at the age of 58. So I hope you enjoyed the story of ordinary Nell Stead, who became Australia's first Duchess.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.